Good evening, good afternoon. So my name is Charles Small, and I'm the director of ISGAP, which is the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. It's okay like this?
Yes.
Mr. Shalom TV, it's okay?
Yes.
Okay. Let's start again. So my name is Charles Small. I'm the director of ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. And today we have a very special event, and I think perhaps at some level, really, maybe one of the most important events that we've done. And it's important because we're introducing Dahn Hiuni, who is a New York-based multidisciplinary artist. His work spans the fields of theater, performance art, visual arts, film and video, as well as graphic design. His work has been presented at such important places as New York venues as PS 122, the Franklin Furnace, Mixed Screens, Artist Spaces, Metro Pictures, Cooper Union College, and the Theater Waxing Project. His exhibitions and performance venues include the Cleveland Performance Art Festival, the Delaware Center for Contemporary Art, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and the Lancaster Museum of Art. His solo performance, 20th Century Art, is part of a permanent collection of the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and his play, Murmurs and Incantations, recently had its New York premiere and was to sold-out audience with a special feature in the playbill.com website. Dr. Hiuni has taught at the Pratt Institute, FIT, Hofstra College, Bracknell, and Kutztown Universities, and at the National Theatre School in Canada. He holds an MFA in art and an interdisciplinary PhD in performance studies, both from Penn State University. He's currently an adjunct professor of art at the School of Visual Arts, Empire State College, and the Hudson County Community College, and a lecturer at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Dan is the son of the late Dahn Hiuni, the Cannes Film Festival award-winning film producer and pioneer of the Israeli film industry. And as I was saying earlier, I think today is one of the most important lectures that ISGAP has ever done. ISGAP has hosted some of the finest scholars of the interdisciplinary study of anti-Semitism literally in the world, as well as leading policy figures and artists and performing artists as well. And I think this is a very important moment because Dan has taken a stand. He spoke out against the BDS movement, but not just the BDS movement as such, many people do. But Dan, I think, touched a nerve that really points to the environment that many scholars, namely Jewish scholars and students, are forced to endure while they are students at universities across the United States, and scholars, professors trying to find a path, a career path, where it's politically, I wouldn't say incorrect, it's political suicide to speak out clearly against the BDS movement. And Dan has very bravely, it's actually quite pathetic that we have to actually say in 2014 bravely spoke out against the manifestations of contemporary anti-Semitism. So it's a great honor that Dan is speaking today, and I'm looking forward to his presentation, but also the work that he's going to do as a result of his strong position he's taken recently. So Dan.
Thank you so much, Charles. It's really an honor to be here. It's been a circuitous route to get to this podium, so it's a great honor. Charles, thank you, Jenny, and all the friends here. And we have a smaller group so we can be more informal, and that's very welcome. Okay. School number one. The chair of my doctoral committee at Penn State, a trusted mentor who was also the director of the art school, accuses me of breaking into the department offices at night to meddle with another student's file. The student had a Muslim-sounding name, and so I was a natural suspect. He and another professor, a big-boned Canadian woman, bring me into their offices and indeed bring me to tears with their ambush of false accusations. Turns out the secretary had misfiled a document of mine in another student's file. They could have simply asked her, but they let their imagination run wild and jumped straight to the trial. I told the dean about it, but he recommended to just let it go and finish my studies. This man, my doctoral committee chair, an Armenian with a bizarre and macabre case of what I can only describe as genocide envy, my new term, and a very rare clinical condition, and I'm not joking, later goes on to censor another Jewish student's on-campus exhibition of pro-Israel, anti-terrorist paintings. Joining him is another professor, a very famous painter at Penn State, with an endowed professorship, who goes around the art school hallways tearing down posters announcing the student exhibition. At a subsequent confrontation, he apparently yells, and this is, as verbatim as I got from a witness there, Israel is a country that has no right to exist, despite having a Jewish girlfriend. This incident makes the national press, and the director is reprimanded. He accepts mandatory enrollment in an anger management course as a condition of keeping his job. School number 2. At the State University of New York, Old Westbury, where I was a permanent adjunct until 2013, the Student Association holds an anti-Israel conference featuring a keynote speaker who is the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. Exploiting a Jewish speaker and a child of survivors to legitimize the biased conference is exceptionally vile to me. I ignore it and focus on my teaching. And you have to understand that I also choose to ignore these things as a matter of, these incidents as a matter of pure self-preservation. These kinds of things make my blood boil, as I'm sure they do yours. And I often feel just short of an aneurysm or some kind of a cardiac event. So I try to avoid getting worked up at every incident. At this school, at the end of a end of year faculty appreciation dinner, I'm sitting with my colleagues and the conversation turns to summer travel. I mention I'm going to Israel, and the chair of the department, a French woman, looks at me with disapproval. I tell the table, oh yes, I'm a big Zionist, just to be a little testy. To which the French woman, my supervisor, recoils with visible disgust and an indiscernible utterance to match, and bites her tongue. Had she not bitten her tongue, it looked like she was about to say something very unnice. At the very same dinner, another senior professor, a colleague, introduces me to someone else from another department, English I believe it was. This woman looks at me squarely and says, wow, I didn't realize we're still letting Israelis on campus. I'm of course stunned, but I cannot issue a comeback, right, or make a scene because I'm an adjunct. And, I'm trying to be on my best behavior and maybe get a tenure track position. Flash forward to my 8th year of teaching there, not 1, but 2 tenure track positions become available. But I only find out about them online in an ad. So no one cares to tell me. After 8 years of faithful teaching, and let me assure you, it's not because I was a bad teacher. I always got the highest evaluations in the department. School number 3. At a faculty meeting at Pratt, I'm really running out of schools to teach here in the New York area. The chair of the art education department jokes to everyone present when he joyfully exclaims, "Where else can you have an Israeli and an Iranian getting along like this at a faculty meeting?" Of course, this was meant to demonstrate the fact that I am Israeli and he is Iranian, and that as chair, he is a benevolent and tolerant figure, like the king of Persia himself. This again is my boss, who can either assign me or not assign me to teaching for the next semester. So one does wonder, do you hide the fact that you're from Israel to get ahead and to simply keep your measly little adjunct position? I was subsequently laid off for reasons that are still unclear. School number 4. I teach art history online for a small college in West Virginia, of all places, but not deep West Virginia. This is just about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. In the cover and safety of the online environment, a few students have taken the opportunity to do some of the usual Israel bashing. Now, these students were literally born yesterday, right? And they know nothing about the Middle East, or at least next to nothing. And you can tell that they're regurgitating things that they've heard from other sources. And it's completely off topic, right? I ask, how has the Renaissance impacted, the fledgling Baroque aesthetic in art history? And so they start, well, Israel, was obviously implicated in this. And it's not just the art world. I mean, it's not just academia, it's also the art world. Incident number 1, and bear with me, this is important to tell you this. With much excitement, I visit the new museum. It's called the New Museum on the Bowery, shortly after it opens. On the 3rd floor, there's an installation by a young artist envisioning the year 2048, when Israel no longer exists. This is the installation. I'm told by the didactic panel on the wall that he is not anti-Israel, he's just, dealing with the political realities of the day. This makes me very mad, and I decide to sneak a little note into the museum installation to express my displeasure. Now, as Peter will tell you, it can get a little over the top sometimes. I hope the artist got it. After calming down, I go down to the lobby gift store to do some browsing, where, on cue, I find a stack of prominently displayed DVDs about the terrible Israeli aggression in Gaza in the new museum gift shop. I don't know if you frequent these places, but this is what you find when you walk into the museum gift shop. And mind you, this is 20 feet away from a plaque of all the donors and patrons that are, let's face it, 95% Jewish names. The irony is obviously lost on the museum and on the gift store buyer, who is indirectly, his job is indirectly made possible by the generosity of these community members. Art World incident number 2. In the mid-90s, I sit on a College Art Association annual conference panel with one of the most prominent living American artists, a very nice Jewish lady. I won't name names. Okay, I'll name names. It's Martha Rosler. Flash forward to 2011, and we're now Facebook friends. Her wall on Facebook, however, is constantly updated with anti-Israel rants and liked by her very large circle of art world groupies and worshipers. I decide to take her on Facebook, and it soon devolves into a very ugly, very public Facebook showdown. Me against this superstar with unusually vicious disciples. This kind of thing really affects your career in the art world, right? Where everyone is a self-righteous, politically correct, postmodern, lefty, activist, robot. I later have to walk by her artwork as it is displayed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where I am a lowly tour guide. The humiliation, which leads me to incident number 3, the Met. The education department is using a map at the Metropolitan Museum of Art of the Middle East for teaching purposes, to teach the kids about the Middle East. And this is not just ancient Egypt. This is today. There's other modern countries labeled except for Israel, of course. Nowhere to be found. When I'm in the office alone, I take a big fat Sharpie and I write Israel on the map. This brings me great pleasure. This on top of one of the worst incidents in memory at the Metropolitan Museum. The curator of the Alexander McQueen show, the Met's most successful show ever of the fashion designer, decides to use the soundtrack from Schindler's List for one of the fashion videos in the exhibition. The John Williams composition that I'm sure you all know, which makes us all weep, and the soundtrack to that film is being trivialized. Really? It's really unbelievable to me. It's not just academia in the art world. I could go on and on. The internet, which I'm sure you've all experienced at the bottom of the articles and at the end of the YouTube videos, where you take the temperature of the culture. Radio every morning now, NPR and WNYC wakes me up with BBC, and Al Jazeera I've heard recently on NPR. Known anti-Israel organizations. Do we not have journalists in this country? The New York Times, that used to be the paper of record, is now on board with all the usual suspects. I hardly ever read it anymore. The Park Slope Food Co-op wants to boycott my Israeli hummus. My students are all wearing Arafat-style keffiyeh scarves, you know, the ones you see on the street. My bank is laundering millions of dollars to terrorists, and you know, the ATM machine greets me in Arabic. You know, where the hell am I? What is going on? I wanted to detail some of these incidents and experiences so that you can understand my cumulative level of frustration and alienation. And I want to preempt this, you know, calling it Islamophobia, because that's really not what it is. I'm having to mourn the loss of what I thought would have been a brilliant career in academia and the art world. Okay, I may not be the greatest artist, but I'm really a good teacher. But clearly I'm not as welcome as I thought. I'm a second-generation Israeli. Both my parents were born in Israel and served in the army. My mother's parents were Sephardic. Her father and his family were banished from Arab lands in the early 20th century, and her mother and family were living in Jerusalem for many generations, originally banished from Spain. My father's side is Ashkenazi. His parents left Poland early in 1922 as young idealistic Zionists and came to this very small strip of land, which was, was then still known by its Roman name, Palestine. This paternal grandmother was one of 8 children who stayed behind. She was one of 8 children, the only one to make it to what was then Palestine. Everybody else stayed behind, and everybody else, of course, was murdered at Treblinka. Her father was a prominent Bialystok rabbi who was burnt alive inside a synagogue with hundreds of other Jews. This grandmother spent many years drying swamps in this forgotten wasteland. She lost her firstborn twin girls to malaria. 20 years later, in 1948, she lost her eldest son when he was killed by a terrorist just days after the War of Independence was supposedly over. Unfortunately, my father, who was a 14-year-old boy, witnessed this entire thing, which is really very unfortunate. It's a very formative trauma in his life, and it kind of kept him running for the rest of his life. And then enter me, born, in the mid-60s, a product of all this tragedy, living out all the subsequent displacement and fragmented identity that comes with such a story, ironically back in the diaspora. As a musical theater performer in my younger days, I used to dance and sing. I would find myself on stage in the Anatevka number in Fiddler. And I understood it, always having to leave. And at sunrise, sunset, I would always cry on stage, which was very distracting. Apparently my life was very much shaped by this terrorist who killed my uncle and traumatized my father. Flash forward 47 years, and here I am telling you about all this crap. And, there's just so much that you can take. So I finally decided that enough was enough and it's time to do something. But I wanted to do it cleverly. I didn't want to just lash out, even though that's all I want to do all day. I decided to, within my own realm, within my own powers, I decided to write a little addendum, a 1-page, a 2-page addendum to my doctoral thesis at Penn State University, which, is in the humanities, right? It has nothing to do with the Middle East. But I symbolically wanted to disown one particular scholar in my doctoral dissertation. Judith Butler. Judith Butler, as you know, is one of the great heroes, and maybe you don't know, in academia today. She's worshipped like a god by postmodernists. She is brilliant. Unfortunately, she is on the wrong side of a certain issue. And so I decided to kind of focus on her, and I have nothing against her personally. I wish her well. I just want to, change her ways. I decided to start my own movement, not BDS, but RDS is what I called it, and it stands for Retractions and Disavowals in Scholarship. And I won't read the whole addendum because you have it in your packet. And some of the packets, if you don't have one on your seat, they're in front of you in the seats, in the vacant seats. I would love for you to have a look at it. But let me read, please. Let me read just one paragraph that I think is crucial. The country that Butler vilifies is the only thriving democracy in the Middle East where someone like her, a woman, a lesbian, a political agitator, would be protected. The people in whose name she purports to speak, however, would oppress, punish, and possibly put her to death for merely who she is. In light of this selective blindness, it can only be surmised that Butler is operating with a special kind of bias. To those who would distinguish between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, I retort, there is no difference. To be anti-Israel is to be anti-Jewish. Israel is the Jewish state. Of course, the other great irony here is that Butler herself is Jewish. Despite this fact, right, she seems to have little to no appreciation for her people's history and the kind of deep memory and moral responsibility that it entails. Instead, she opts to identify with the neo-leftist academics whose zealous and sanctimonious policing of global injustices have cultivated this very special and disproportionate animosity towards Israel. Instead of allowing her persecuted status as a Jewish lesbian to inform a subtle, empathic interpretation, she preemptively apologizes for her academic success and social acceptance by self-effacingly criticizing her own people, which is a classic and all too common unconscious self-hatred that we've seen many times before with Marx and Arendt and Chomsky. But I'll let you read the rest on your own. Of course, Penn State refused to add my addendum. I just wanted them to slip it in the middle of the night into the library, where this thesis, well, no one's ever going to read this anyway. It's symbolic, but no, absolutely not. And they met me with some very kind of durable institutional inflexibility. So I decided to disseminate it myself. I sent it to as many people as I could. I emailed it. I posted it on Facebook. I started circulating it around the internet. And lo and behold, I'm starting to hear from people. I'm getting a response. My hero, Phyllis Chesler, who wrote a very important book about 13 years ago, decides that I emailed it to her just to thank her for the inspiration. She writes an article in the Israel National News. And the articles are getting comments. They're getting comments. Joshua Levitt, Mr. Levitt, who's here, thank you so much for coming, writes a brilliant piece in the Allgemeiner. And I always say, is it Allgemeiner or Allgemeiner? Allgemeiner. Really capturing the arc of this whole story. And I thank him greatly. I get a congratulatory email from none other than Alan Dershowitz. Who knew? I get a phone interview from a Tel Aviv radio station. I am on a blog in Australia. A poet from Nigeria writes me. It is really quite amazing, right? And this could not have happened a generation ago or even, 10 years ago. And we start a Facebook group, and we call it RDS. And we have 75 members right now, and it's growing. And finally, Mr. Charles Asher Small somehow finds my phone number and calls me, and this is the greatest honor. You know, this is it. This is like the top you can get, right, in this field. And he invites me to collaborate with him. And apparently, I did as he says. I touched a nerve. You know, it's funny. I should have done this earlier. It's been brewing for so long. God, I waited too long. But never. It's better late than never. Interesting, the timing, because right around that time, Butler was supposed to give a talk about Kafka at the Jewish Museum. The Jewish Museum invited her. But this time, it didn't work. The pressure was very strong. I'm wondering if it was the timing, but it did happen within a matter of weeks that the curatorship at the Jewish Museum, who run in the same circles as the academics that I spoke about, invited her. But from all the pressure, she decided to bow out, or maybe she was asked to bow out at the last minute. Mr. Levitt wrote another great article, which was then picked up by Haaretz, I believe, which is Israel's greatest, most important newspaper. And suddenly I'm in Haaretz. Who knew? Shortly thereafter, Butler issues a joint statement with Rashid Khalidi, who's a very prominent Palestinian academic, complaining.
Friend of Obama.
I'm sorry?
A good friend of
And
Obama.
a good friend of Obama, thank you. Complaining that they're being censored. Oh my goodness. And she's really getting a taste of the medicine. The most amazing thing happens when, out of the blue, lo and behold, Judith Butler, none other than the Judith Butler, emails me. Right? And some people really, again, consider this woman to be God, not to exaggerate. And granted, I mean, she is one of the great living American philosophers. And she's emailing me. Who am I? She's emailing me. And this is what she says. Dear Dahn Hiuni, I'm wondering whether you might be willing to meet for coffee or tea in NYC sometime in April. I would like a chance to have a conversation with you. I have the sense we might be able to understand each other in person, and I would welcome that chance. It's lovely. Judith Butler. I actually consulted with my new group, my RDS Facebook group, and let everybody kind of like help me decide what to do about this email. Because it was a critical juncture. And at the end I decided not to meet her and not to reply. I felt like, and I'm a teacher, right? Like dialogue, Socratic dialogue is my thing. I felt like I had heard enough of Judith Butler for the time being. And, you know, maybe if I have a podium for 15 minutes, maybe it's time for her to hear from me. And so I think the greatest thing about this whole story is to never underestimate the power of one individual. You know, I'm an immigrant from the Middle East. I'm like a little art professor. Who am I? But she decided that I was worthwhile talking to. Maybe she wanted to neutralize me. Maybe she wanted to have an honest conversation. I'm not sure. I'm willing to have a conversation with her, but in public. I'm a little afraid of her. So I'm willing to do it if, Columbia or Berkeley or these other institutions that she's associated with invite me. I'm very happy that this is just the beginning. We are now under the auspices of ISGAP with the generous support of Charles. We're going to take this forward. We're going to keep going. We are announcing today that we are forming a group, and we, after much thought, have decided to call it Scholars for the Legitimate Defense of Israel. Scholars for the Legitimate Defense of Israel. SLDI. Is that right? And this will be a group that provides a rigorous academic refuting of the BDS movement. And it's going to be intellectual and it's going to be academic. There will also be, let me just take a drink. There will also be a subgroup that will address, on a personal level, the experiences of Jewish and Israeli professors in academia. We thought about calling it the trauma of expressing forbidden ideas, or simply Zionists Anonymous, ZA. This group will serve to, just like the feminists did in the 60s and 70s, to do some much needed consciousness raising about, to speak, to give voice to these experiences that are very real and very painful. And I know some of you have them. And I'm happy to say that eminent psychiatrist and Columbia professor, Larry Amsel, Larry, will be joining me to co-moderate this portion of the group, the more therapeutic aspect of it. And I'm really looking forward to it. I'm thrilled. You know, it's funny, is at a certain point in life you have to realize maybe your calling was not exactly what you thought it was, you know. But here it is, and I welcome it, and so thank you. Thank you very much.
So Dan, thank you very much. So we'll have time for Q&A.
Absolutely.
I really thank you very much for your presentation and your work. And I could probably speak for about 5 hours about all the experiences that I and my colleagues over the years have had. But I know you've touched on something where students and professors from the United States, Canada, Europe, and beyond have been directly affected by it. So really thank you for your amazing intervention. Thank you, Josh Levitt, for helping to amplify this issue. Josh is here, the author of the article. And Larry. So Larry Amsel is going to be the co-host of the therapeutic side. Do you have a comment or a question?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for a wonderful talk. I thought that was just so elegantly put together. So many times I've heard people try to discuss this issue, and it's just a rave. And this was.
Okay, 1 minute. Why don't you take the mic?
So often I think people just rave and they haven't captured it. I think when you say that this is the combination of your artistry, because I think it is your artistry that has allowed this issue to come out in a way that it is being heard. Many of us have raved about it, gone crazy, but you really have found a voice. You found a voice, you found a medium, you found a mechanism where it can't be ignored. Somehow there was something about the aesthetic of the way that you expressed this that was magic, and I want to thank you for that, from all of us. I really want to thank you. And just to share that we've been through this. About 7 years ago, I teach at the medical center, and people who are very good teachers are sometimes invited to teach at the downtown campus. I was invited to teach introductory biology at Columbia. And my research assistant, who happened to be Israeli himself, first day that I met him, he said, "Larry, I know that you're Jewish, but please do not mention Israel." I said, "Avital, I'm teaching biology. I'm not teaching Middle East things." He said, "Doesn't matter. Don't mention it and don't let the students bring it up. It's going to be a catastrophe." So every course at Columbia, okay, was I would say had this toxic element where this could come up. And my students turned out to be actually not. Columbia has a very, very good reputation. They weren't that bright, I have to say, in terms of the biology. They didn't know very much biology. They weren't well trained, but every one of them was a Said scholar. It was really amazing. So, for giving us voice, I thank you again and again. Thanks so much.
Any other comments or questions?
Dr. Max Weinreich, who was the director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, wrote in 1946 a book entitled Hitler's Professors. and he documented how academia collaborated with the Nazis. Not because of fear, but because of ideology. What is happening now all over the world is a replay of Hitler's professors. I very much doubt that talking, this is not rational, and talking academically and explaining and all that, I think it's not going to be effective. What is going to be effective is for all of us to study the writing of Goebbels, because the art of propaganda, we are watching now 60 years of propaganda financed by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and we are seeing the fruit.
Yes.
You go into a hotel in Egypt, you see on the shelves the protocols of the Elders of Zion. You go to a museum and you see a video, that's the same thing. We have to learn from Goebbels because they learned from him.
I mean, in Egypt, I can understand, but in...
Please, this is a question.
It's a comment.
Yes.
And you comment.
Please. I mean, in Egypt, gift store at the hotel, I would understand, but in New York?
It's the same thing.
Yes, but it's, yeah, I mean, they're both shocking. They're both shocking, and, and we have a colleague here from NYU, and NYU has opened its satellite campus in Abu Dhabi, I believe it is, or Dubai, Abu Dhabi, where they are very happily supported financially. But it's a Jewish school. It's the ironies are just replete and all around us. Please.
I just wanted to just comment. I mean, I would love to. I could talk for hours about the horrible experiences I've had at the threats.
Who are you?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm Leora Brosh. I'm Israeli. I teach at NYU and also at the University of Connecticut. I've taught at CUNY and at SUNY. I teach English. I'm an English professor. And English is rabidly anti-Israeli. I've been threatened very directly that I will not get tenure or promotion if I don't, quote, keep your Zionist views to yourself. And I've learned to be quiet, and I've suffered like Dahn. I think there's been a boycott of Israeli academics for a very long time. It's being very subtle, and it's hard to pin down. I've been in situations where I should have been promoted and I wasn't, and you never know what's going on behind the scenes. Academia is very subtle. The comment I wanted to make is about the curriculum. Because I teach English, I've had the same kinds of hardships as Dahn, but I also watch my colleagues teaching anti-Israeli material in every single possible course. And so that if it's Shakespeare and especially composition, so I want to talk a minute about composition. Every student in America is required to take 2 semesters in composition, and the composition textbooks are full of Edward Said, full of anti-Israel toxic material. There's nothing in there with an alternative viewpoint. There's nobody submitting alternative articles to the publishers, and the students are simply being brainwashed. And what we're seeing now is the result of years of anti-Israel material in a lot of humanities departments, in all kinds of venues. So it's a subtle, difficult war because it means getting into a lot of different disciplines and publishing in different disciplines. And we're a minority voice. So I wanted to talk about the curriculum and the problem of the curriculum and add that layer to our discussion.
And that's so interesting because obviously I can only speak to my experience, which is arts and visual arts and maybe a little bit of theater. But it's very important to come at it from different disciplines and to get all this information. Of course, composition is the only required course, right, of freshmen. So who controls composition?
Edward Said.
Edward Said.
So if I, just very briefly, I think your comment about professors and Max Wainwright's book on Hitler's professors is very important. And what's, this could be a moment, but academia, universities under Nazi-controlled Germany and beyond, the university was the only institution that scholars, without the law, without the police, without force, removed Jewish scholars from the university and Jewish students. They voluntarily did it. And I think your point is very important, that academia, and what you were saying, academia is at the cutting edge of the BDS movement and brainwashing students. And what is remarkable to me, beyond the Green Line, beyond Israel, if there was something that was more democratic, more inclusive, more strongly advocating citizenship for all under one legal system, better education, better universities, better hospitals than Israel, you could imagine. But what's beyond the Green Line? What's there? It's reactionary social movements that are anti-democratic, anti-citizenship, sexist, marginal, subjugating women, homophobic to the sense where they are eliminating gay people from society, hanging them on cranes, like in Iran, literally, in public squares, putting people on cranes and having public execution of gay people and then criminals. No tolerance for religious minorities under the law. Religious minorities have to be second-class citizens. And we have a university system, and even, I was at Yale, and I was just talking about this afternoon, we have a program at Yale University that blames Zionism on the discrimination against Jews in Arab countries, which is absurd. We have a history professor that is a leading historical revisionist of the Holocaust on the advisory board of this anti-Semitism program at Yale, namely Tim Snyder, who's, as you know from YIVO, is a very serious problem. And we have people from the programming hosting and participating in events. Imagine an anti-Semitism program where they are coming to the conclusion that the BDS movement is not anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist, but it's absurd. We're living in absurd times, and I think what you're doing, hopefully that will create a movement here, is to fight back with rational thought and logic, and to fight the hypocrisy. And this hypocrisy is seeping into social policy, domestically, internationally, foreign policy, and we can see this vacuum is being filled in the Middle East and now even in Europe by these reactionary elements that are going unchecked. And I'll just say one final point. When the P5+1, the leading nations of the democratic world signed an interim agreement with Ayatollah Khamenei, the Iranian revolutionary regime, and the supreme leader went on a diatribe calling Jews dogs that are going to be obliterated, and not one Western leader said, you know what, maybe we should postpone the interim agreement. Maybe we should say something. Not a word from the leaders of the democratic country, and you can see this vacuum of decency is being filled quickly in more parts of the world because of our silence on these issues. This is an important issue to Jewish scholars and Jewish students, but it's beyond. It's an issue of human rights. Human rights in our institutions, in our democratic institutions, and if universities, Henri Bernard Levy said that universities and intellectuals must be the space where light is shined into darkness. That this is the role of intellectuals and the role of universities. And when we refuse to shine light into darkness, we're in big, big trouble. And one final note, I'm also Israeli. I'm proud to be.
Yes, I have a question and a comment. I'm Martin Rothstein, I'm a lawyer. I'm also an adjunct professor at New York Law School. And as I focus on what I think is a core issue, you can express it two ways. One is those who are anti-Israel, whether Jewish or not, really anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic, and I believe they are from what I know of Jewish history and the people that are doing it. And the converse of that, where you have Jewish organizations, foundations, and monastery institutions who charter mandate that they support Jewishness and Jewish offense, and they are in effect supporting BDS directly and indirectly. How do you answer that? to say that it is anti-Semitism and that it's contrary to the mandate of these organizations to support BDS without writing a whole essay on Jewish history and the foundation of Israel and trying to educate people about something they know absolutely nothing about. So what I'm looking for is talking points, verbiage, either from the excellent speaker or anyone else here, of how to answer this in 2 or 3 sentences without going into a 2-hour rant, which I'm very able to do, but it's usually counterproductive.
I think,
Please repeat the question.
please, John, did you want to repeat?
Yeah, so the question is, so very quickly, if I understood correctly, scholars always try to distinguish between classical forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel rhetoric, and they try to separate it. And how do you respond to it in an
Right, and how
intelligent
do you
way?
respond to Jewish organizations that claim they are supporting the Jewish people, but are in whole or in part anti-Israel?
So I think, I would argue, if anybody's anti-Israel, it's problematic in terms of, there's 6 million Jews living in a hostile environment, and if you're anti the state, which is protecting them, you're putting people's lives in a precarious situation, number one. Just very briefly, I wrote an article with Edward Kaplan in which we interviewed 5,000 people in Europe in 10 different countries, and we compared classical forms of anti-Semitism, which with what we called Israel bashing. And what we discovered is that those who are classically anti-Semitic based on our criteria are those who are Israel bashers are 13 times more likely than the average population to be anti-Semitic in the classical sense. So if something was 13 times more likely to cause cancer in the local pharmacy or drugstore, it would be removed from the shelves and it would be a national inquiry how this could be sold. So the correlation between anti-Semitism and those who hate Israel is very strong. And very, it proves what everybody knows in your gut, but we proved it scientifically, mathematically. So that's one place you can go to show the correlation, scientifically.
And I think Mr. Levitt wanted to directly respond to you.
I'll tell you, there was, Dan didn't give himself enough credit. When I had a first chance to interview him, I also thought he really eloquently could tell his story. And then the second time we did it was a week later. A week later.
Please repeat the question.
Please, Joshua, come on up. It's informal, you may as well come up.
More of a writer than a speaker. I had a chance to interview Dan, and he really was eloquent. He told the story very much like we heard it today. And it was a week later. He didn't give himself enough credit, actually, because a week later, we just got a small announcement that the Jewish Museum was hosting Judith Butler. And it wasn't actually a lecture. It was part of a series. It was, and this is maybe like the most ironic part of it, there's an Andy Warhol series of 10 famous Jews that he made portraits of. And one of them was Golda Meir and Albert Einstein, I think, and also Kafka. And so the way that they were doing it was every month they were going to have the director of the museum, or the sub-director of the museum, interview a famous scholar, and Judith Butler was to be the famous scholar of Kafka, and she was going to actually pretend that she was Kafka, and he was going to be asking her questions. And I asked Dan, one morning when I was sort of assigned an article on what we could find out about this, and he really said this was a terrible, terrible thing. And I think he put it really right, saying, how is the Jewish Museum, which is supposed to be a Jewish institution, supporting this woman who's trying to take down Jews and Jewish institutions? And we wrote an article, and I had to send to the museum to get a comment from them. And this is really to answer your question. I said, I've been to your museum a lot of times. On the second floor, there's a huge exhibit on anti-Semitic propaganda. It's one of my favorite exhibits. And it's amazing because it shows protocols of Elders of Zion in 50 different languages. It shows the German beer steins that were made to look like Jews. And maybe there's like 5 or 6 different exhibits. And I said, how are you having this lady who seems to be talking Jewish propaganda against Jews? And specifically, the famous quote we keep attributing to her, which is really accurate, is she calls Hamas, which is Israel's sworn enemy, and she calls it a progressive institution of the left, and how it's. So anyway, so the short story of the Jewish Museum was just to really ask them,
how are you, this person, how is this even your whole, in their case, a whole exhibit on propaganda, but you can mention any program that any Jewish institution has done, or you can ask them, how is this even connected to what it is you supposedly stand for? And the reason why I said Dan didn't take enough credit was because he wrote this article, and people really liked it, and by the end of the day, this was an event that you had to RSVP for, but you didn't actually have to buy tickets, and so there was only as many seats as there were in the auditorium. And there's a group of, I'm not sure they're Jewish leaders, they're really just Jewish activists like you are. And there's a mailing list, and I found my name on it, and there's 108 other people on it. And they asked each other to go RSVP for all the tickets. And so within half an hour, all the tickets had been RSVP'd, and then they were sort of sending messages that they were going to make a demonstration in front of the museum in front of the evening of this event. But I think the museum got the message pretty fast that none of their events had ever sold out in an hour or something. And by the end of the night, they really had withdrawn it. And there was also some controversy over whether she had withdrew. And according to this list of Jewish people in New York, one of them is a fund manager, and one of his clients is on the board of the museum, and he specifically went to that board member, and this really answers your question too, and he said the exact same thing that I just said to you, that this person is against the Jewish people. Really, it's against the mission of the museum. Really, if you're on the board, you should say something. And no one had really said, and this was obviously a wealthy person, he said something to the board, and that was it, and they withdrew the invitation. So I think maybe the answer, I think what Dan said, a couple things was really relevant. One is that people don't realize the power that they have until someone really puts them in a position to show it. And I also think, though, that institutions, when they hear from it from someone, and then they ask, and that person doesn't get the right answer, and they ask the media to help them amplify their voice. And then there are a lot of people who read those articles, and I certainly don't think there's a lot of people that read every article in the newspaper, but what I found out is that articles like Dan's get sent around to a lot of different places. And the ones that are good get picked up by Hartz and everybody else. So the short answer is, I think, is if you actually, a nice biblical reference I was telling to Larry last time we had this event, that if you lead from the front, you actually do something on your own, things happen. If you try to lead from the back, then nothing really happens, you never win.
And it took, it took so many years to make that happen. But of course, I'm preaching here to the converted, and so I want to ask you for a specific favor. I'm hoping that you might consider photocopying my statement, maybe 25 copies or 50 copies, and perhaps if you're willing to share it and circulate it with friends and colleagues, and even people who you're not sure will welcome it. That would make me so happy, because if there's 20 or 25 people here, times 50, that's good. That's good. Young gentleman in the back, you had your hand up before, Nate. Please.
Yes, Dr. Hiuni, I have a question regarding, it seems that on the SJP, the EDS side, you have these cults of personality, really very organized professorships, departments that really have a strong following of students and also strong networks between themselves within the university and also connected outside of universities. So I think it's really great that we're starting now with RDS, and I know in New Jersey, also Metro West, there's a certain council of Jewish professors who are trying to work on creating their own networks. But my question is, what's really the biggest obstacle that's stopping Jewish professors or professors with a Zionistic inclination to organize and reach out to each other and make their own voices heard?
Yes, the last bit of it was, what is stopping a greater mobilization of Jewish, not necessarily Israeli, but or maybe both professors to combat this. I think I gave a little bit of a taste of it in the talk in terms of, unfortunately, it's now become one or the other. That's, without being too dramatic, it's academic suicide to do what I'm doing. And I had nothing to lose anymore, because I realized that my future was not in the American Academy.
Tenured professors are also scared for their job?
I think they're probably scared a little less. I think they probably feel a little more empowered. But depending on the field, there are fields that are a little more, Israel-friendly, within academia. And on the opposite end of that is the humanities and the arts. And I think that it's very much about the climate of your department and your department chair, and you can see what kinds of department chairs that I have to deal with over the years. Many of whom are international, by the way. It's very interesting. But I don't think, despite all of these obstacles, I think that it's gotten to a critical point, and I think that it's really important to start to mobilize. I have to say one other thing, and you'll forgive me for it might come across as being a little critical, but I'm criticizing family members here, in that there is a certain ambivalence in Jewish American circles and academics who feel somehow that it still feels somehow that it's over there, that it's in the Middle East, that it's on the news, and that Israel is, it's part of their realm, but it's not directly going to affect them or their lives. And I've gotten to a point where I really want to take issue with that kind of ambivalence, with that kind of feeling protected by America, by the ocean. And I think that it's time to really question that, to really look at that again. I mean, we always think that surely in our modern generation, this is it. Like we're not going to face the same things that our ancestors faced, and you always want to think hopefully like that. But the truth is that this has been going on forever, right? For millennia, and it's probably not going to stop just when we're alive, or just for our kids. And what's going to happen when this country eventually, when this empire eventually declines, and is not there, to protect us? So it's a call from within, I think, for us to really meet this head on, and to not feel somehow removed. I would also take all my academic friends to Israel, some of whom have never been.
I just wanted to mention that I saw Protocols of the Elders of Zion on sale in the street in Jackson Heights, one of these street booksellers, in Spanish. And I've been, I tried to say something that, you shouldn't sell this book, but it was like completely,
Amazing. In Jackson Heights,
in Jackson
where
Heights,
I have Indian food
Yeah.
on the street, a bookseller selling it.
It wasn't near the Indian food. It's like in the Hispanic part
Mhm.
of Jackson Heights. And another thing, actually, I have many examples running through my head. Well,
Please.
I have a friend who works as a teacher, as an English teacher, in a Muslim school on Queens Boulevard. There is a Muslim school, Razi. And there was an international day there, Day of Countries, where, many parents came and so
Sure.
forth, and everybody had flags and so forth, and everyone had, like, boys and girls had to speak about countries that they chose to speak about, like that they learned information, geography and so forth. And there was one boy speaking about Palestine, and it didn't include Israel at all. It was here in New York City, in Queens. He was just speaking about Palestine, from the river to the sea, to the south it's this, to the north it's this, to the east it's the, to the west it's the, the sea. And it was right here. It wasn't somewhere in,
Yes.
in Saudi Arabia.
Uncontested by the educators there that day.
Completely and I told this friend of mine, that she should write about this, send a letter to maybe, I don't know, New York Times, but I think she was afraid to do that. But it's a good idea to where to send a description of this event, you know, where would you recommend? When?
Sent to my newspaper, basically writing every single day about something.
So
Which is your
also-
newspaper?
It's a newspaper called Allgemeiner.
Oh, Allgemeine.
And it's this old-fashioned newspaper. It was first made in Yiddish as an international Jewish newspaper. And the guy who founded it had been a real journalist. And he was actually famous for finding Eichmann. He was a part of that was like his big story. But anyway, he made this international Jewish newspaper, and he passed away in 2005. A young guy took it over. And he really changed the kind of tone of the paper. It really just covers anti-Semitism, and it covers Israel very positively. But more than anything, like all the most popular articles are things like that, where someone is, or things like the interview with Dan, like where someone is actually standing up for something. Because I think the thing that even surprised me was that anytime you see something and it upsets you, there's actually millions of other people who are actually also upset by it, and no one really says anything. So it's kind of like the way to...
Yeah. I think that's one of the nice things is that coming out,
Coming out.
in my multiple comings out in my life, this one was a very difficult one, and but I'm finding my community, I'm finding folks here in this room, in Leora, and we're going to find each other. And I think that kind of, again, the feminist model of consciousness raising is very, very important. It's important to speak it, to verbalize it, to articulate it, to say this, this pain has happened, not to be too, therapy about it, but, and then to move forward, because until you identify it, if you're not willing to call on it, so.
It's interesting, parts of the country.
Just a little louder.
Parts of the country, community laws are being pushed so gay people can't be served by other people in government agencies. Where are we in terms of many of the things you're just mentioning in your own personal life? But other people, a bigger, because it would expose ultimately, global anti-Semitism, which is constant in the country. Some of these things should be legally pushed forward. Like, why isn't this being done? Once somebody does something, it becomes a bigger.
Yes.
Yeah.
Charles, do you want to speak about the New York legislature who was trying to legislate against BDS?
So there's some.
There are things, but
Yeah, I don't know very much about it, but I know that in Albany, it's and if anybody knows more, they can fill us in. They've proposed a law that it would be illegal, and state universities, such as the one that I was teaching at Westbury, would not be funded if they continue to pass these anti-Israel and these kind of BDS types of boycotts, which very welcome news to me.
also, with BDS, I don't remember the exact amount, but the vast majority of congressmen signed an anti-BDS amendment too a couple of months ago. So there are forces to be harnessed.
Maybe more media-wise, you'd be driven to know this is out there in the normal discussion. People know that it's
I just want to go back 1 minute to the Jewish
Please.
Museum, because I think there's a piece of the puzzle here that's quite important. When the Jewish Museum disinvited Judith Butler, they made a disclaimer that this was going to be a purely literary event. And Judith herself said, this was going to be a purely literary event. But we believe that's absolutely impossible for Judith Butler to speak about Franz Kafka as a literary event, and we see proof of that. Because in the London Review of Books, she wrote a lengthy diatribe called Who Owns Kafka? And in that article, she talks about the archive, the Franz Kafka archive, that is in the possession of a woman in Tel Aviv, and it's up for sale. And lo and behold, the Jewish National Library in Jerusalem wants to own it. And she claims great reasons why the Jews and the state of Israel and the Jewish state should not own it whatsoever. And she goes on to use Kafka as a cudgel against Jews and the Zionist people. Not only do we have this wonderful transcript that she wrote, the London Review of Books sponsored her at the British Museum. And at the British Museum, you can go and listen to her actually speak the transcript that she wrote in the London Review of Books, in which she attacks the Jewish state viciously using Kafka as a political weapon. So to believe that she's going to go to the Jewish Museum and just impersonate Kafka and not be a political event is a lie. It's a bold-faced lie.
And I recommend everybody in this room should read it because she's brilliant. She is brilliant, but so hateful, but brilliant. I really recommend people to read it.
And I guess that's why it's so difficult.
You don't have to read it. You can actually listen to the audio of it.
Yeah. And as a footnote to this, I actually needed police protection to leave the British Museum because I spoke there on critiquing Orientalism. There was a conference on Edward Said's Orientalism. I was revisiting Orientalism, and I was the only one to speak, critiquing the critique. And I was writing about the Hamas Charter, and I wrote about the Hamas Charter and the Iranian Revolutionary Regime. I needed to be escorted physically with police out of the space of the very civilized British Museum. One more point. How many people have read the Hamas Charter here? Out of curiosity. Please read it. And in terms of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, if it wasn't such a serious covenant or constitution, it would almost be like a Monty Python skit. Because here's a reactionary social movement that wants to rid Palestine of all outside influences. And it uses the protocols of the Elders of Zion as the theme running through the covenant, the constitution. This is the main document of the Hamas movement. It's not the military wing or the extremist elements, it's the foundation of Hamas. And for Judith Butler to refer to Hezbollah and Hamas as part of the global progressive left is absurd. It's really absurd.
Which is why, in the end, I decided not to have a dialogue with her because I thought that it was, she went way beyond.
I just want to say, I think, in every generation or every century, Jews have a struggle with anti-Semitism, and each one of those struggles has its unique features. I think one of the unique features of the struggle against anti-Semitism that we are facing is that there are so many Jews on the other side. And I think and one has to not be confused or cowed by that. I'm not exactly sure how to deal with it. I'm not exactly sure whether dialogue is possible or one simply does. But it is. I think there have always been collaborators. I mean, during Hitler's times there were collaborators, but I think in this time it's a unique feature of this, and we have to, with the wisdom of Charles and the kind of academic work that he's doing, the thinking kind of work that we're doing, I think we have to think our way beyond it.
I think part of the reason is the Jews in America are so comfortable and so secure that they have no sense of community with the Jews of Israel. They've lost it.
But also, I think, I agree, I'll say as a caveat to this, we're running out of time, that we also have to critically examine power relations. How did J Street appear, and why did it appear right after the election 5.5 years ago? Who saw Alinsky? Who saw Alinsky? Saul Alinsky is a very important philosopher, thinker, who inspired some great political leaders in this country. And Alinsky spoke about dividing your enemy and bringing a small part of your enemy close to you. This community, if you look at it from a political science perspective, from a critical perspective, this community is intentionally being divided, and it's being very successful. And we have to look at why, and what are the powers that be, and what are the forces that be, in a very rational, academic sense. And there's something happening in the United States more so than other diaspora communities. You have these detractors in other communities, but not so quick and not so much, and why? And we need to have a critical view of what's happening to our community and to our institutions. Thank you very much. So Dahn is going to head this new project. I hope, God willing, it'll be an important project that will know a few bounds. So it will be Scholars for the legitimate defense of Israel. So you're all very welcome to sign up with Dan, and I hope that this project will proceed rapidly, grow rapidly, and have the impact that it deserves to have. And Jenny is sending me signs saying,
Oh, don't forget to take the folders since they have Dahn Hiuni's addendum to his PhD.
great. And then also one final note, Wednesday we have Benny Weinthal, who's a leading journalist and a fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. He actually touches on many of the themes that we discussed today. He'll be speaking here at 5:30 on Wednesday. So everybody's welcome for that. We have other events that the schedule is in your packet. Thank you very much for coming. And Dan, thank you very much for continuous training.